Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this week. Today we have Dr. Daniel Widener here to discuss Black and Brown unity. But before we get into the discussion, Connie is going to lead us in our land acknowledgement today, so I'll pass it over to her.
Hello, everybody. All right, so we recognize that California State University San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution founding of 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty, and we will work to hold California State University San Marino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous people.
All right, I'll briefly introduce our guest today, Dr. Daniel Widener from University of California, San Diego, and his talk will be An Art for Both My Peoples, Visual Cultures of Black-Brown Unity. Professor Widener teaches history at UC San Diego. He's the author of Black Arts West, Culture and Struggle in Postwar Los Angeles from Duke University Press, and we'll send out a link for the attendees with that title. And he's the co-editor of Another University is Possible. His past and current political affiliations include the Venceremos Brigade, Community in Support of the Gang Truce, the National Congress for Puerto Rican Rights, the Labor Community Strategy Center, Bus Riders Union, and Pillars of the Community. I'll turn the floor over now to Professor Widener.
Thanks, Jeremy, for that introduction, very kind introduction. And thanks to everyone for the introduction and the opportunity to be with you this afternoon. I'm gonna pop my screen up on there and hopefully everybody can see that, hear me. And just to say that I'm gonna talk this afternoon, this afternoon, for a little while about visual cultures of Black-Brown unity, essentially about the effort made by artists, creative people, and museum curators and other folks to kind of think about ways that visual art might become a bridge between African-American and Latino communities, particularly between people of ethnic Mexican descent, Mexican communities, Mexican-American people. And the center of the talk is really Southern California from the 1990s, mid-1990s to the present. I'll try to do my best to stop with plenty of time for Q&A. People can hold their heckling till the end, and we'll see where that goes. Right? I hope that we'll be able to have a really sincere dialogue that follows on from my presentation. So I want to just start by saying that the title of my talk is taken from a quote by a woman named Elizabeth Catlett Mora, who was an African-American artist. She moved to Mexico City in 1947. She got a grant fellowship. She went there and joined a printmaking workshop and decided to remain in Mexico. Later, because of her political commitments, the United States government tried to have her deported from Mexico back to the United States. This was during the McCarthy period, 1950s. And she renounced her American citizenship and instead became a Mexican citizen, which would offer her some protection from deportation back to the United States. As punishment for that, the United States for decades refused to allow her to return to the United States. So she became something of a figure whose political life and art symbolized her commitment to both the liberation of African-American people and also the struggle of Mexican popular forces. She did a lot of printmaking and sculpture about both communities. She's also a person who's known in African-American history and art as one of the initial kind of forerunners of what we would today call intersectionality, a person who tried in her visual work to link concerns of race, class, and gender. And in fact, she sometimes would define herself as two, right? As both a Mexican and an African-American. And at other times she would say, I have four identities, as a Mexican, an African-American, as a worker and as a woman. So she was a person who had a lot of commitments over the arc of her life. But the two central pillars of those commitments were really around the liberation and political struggle of African Americans and of ethnic Mexican people. And so I chose her as a kind of starting point. You can see here two pieces. The piece in the center is called Mujer Indígena, indigenous or Indian woman. And on the right is a depiction of an African American sharecropper. You can see in both cases, there's an attempt to really depict a kind of internal strength in both communities. Her art really focuses on centering individuals as exemplars of those peoples, as opposed to, well, I'll just say that and I'll move on, because otherwise I'll be there forever on this one slide. And I'm going to just start with a couple of slides, and I'm going to move into a context of a discussion about the notion of a conflict between these two communities, and some of the different ways that visual culture tried to respond to that. So this is a mural that some of you may have seen if you're from Los Angeles. It's called Resurrection. It's by a woman named Noni Olabisi, and it's at Susan Miller Dorsey High School. So it's on the side of a wall at a high school that's in the western part of what we would call South Los Angeles, right? So it's not South Central proper. It's in the kind of Crenshaw district. And this is a school today that's about maybe 50 to 55% African-American and about 45 or so percent Latinx students. So it's about a 99% minority school over, quote unquote. I don't know how you can be a minority when you're 99% of the population, but nonetheless, you have these two populations, which are the larger populations in the school. And that's been that case for some time. And so Olabisi painted this mural there to kind of symbolize the potential common origins and roots, and the kind of pre-Columbian and pre-colonial elements of both communities. So it's a kind of attempt to place those communities in conversation visually without a reference point of Europe, right? Without a reference to the conquest of the Americas or the enslavement of African people or the necessarily the struggle against imperialism, but to suggest that these communities have a common set of aesthetic, spiritual, cosmological, familial kinds of ideas at their heart, at their cultural root, that extends beyond the notion of always referencing either group through recourse to Europe or European Americans. I'll have more to say about that. So Dorsey is really an interesting place. For those of you who know LA, as I said, it's on the western part of South Los Angeles. And this is an area that's historically been an important multi-ethnic gateway. In the 1930s and 1940s, 1950s, it was a place that had a large African-American and Japanese-American population. And some of you may know the story of the Crenshaw district, which still retains a kind of African-American and Japanese-American population. So this is an area that's long had a kind of interethnic or kind of multiracial community toward it. And so I think it's a useful point of departure for thinking about the ways in which the racial past of Southern California, not just Los Angeles, places also like San Diego, obviously in the Central Valley, Riverside, that these have long been places where we had multiple communities of color that were intersecting, sometimes through a common struggle against white supremacy, sometimes through a process of living side by side, other times through being positioned differently in the racial order. But in every case, these are places where what we would call diversity today, or what we would think of as this kind of new moment where we have people from all over the world, is really revealed as something that's been going on in some cases for more than a century. And so as the rest of the United States starts to look more like California, the argument would go, some of the circumstances and situations that we find taking place in Southern California in recent years offer us a kind of preview, perhaps, or a set of options for thinking about some ways that the future of the early 21st century might unfold. So again, just to make the point that when we think about the history of California generally, Southern California in particular, these conquests over space, over who can be where, and over what the terms are under which you can be where, are really important time and time again. You know, so for those of you who, again, maybe from LA or who maybe have gone out in LA, who know the pre-COVID nightlife scene in LA, we tend to associate Hollywood as a place that's a center for entertainment, right? Not just for films, but nightclubs, other kinds of spots. This shot actually on the right, which warns Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants to stay out of this particular area, it's actually from Hollywood. Prior to the 1950s, the center of entertainment in Southern California was really Central Avenue. It was the inner city district associated with African Americans. And what you start to see in the 50s and 60s is a concerted effort by the police to keep particularly white youth out of what comes to be called the ghetto as a way to suppress racial mixing. And you see the shift in clubs to places like Hollywood and to what we'd call the South Bay, Redondo Beach, Torrance, those kinds of areas. And so you see a kind of racial geography about who can live where youth can be, and a racial order that's not so much about excluding Black people from other spaces as it is from drawing a line between white folks and other communities of color. This isn't universally the pattern that segregation takes in the United States. In some places, you could argue that there's a different kind of anti-Blackness fixed in place. But in Southern California, historically, the question was keeping white folks away from other communities of color rather than isolating Black people from all other communities. And that'll be important as we go forward. So again, as we see, we have this kind of pattern and struggle over the conquest of space, the concentration of African Americans into particular areas, Latinos, Asian Americans into others, and the systematic de-investment in those areas. So that's going to explode, as we know, in violence. In 1965, the Watts Rebellion jumps off. That's the largest riot in American history since the time of the New York City draft riots and the Civil War. About 33 people are killed, overwhelmingly African Americans. For those of you who've been around in these talks a long time and came to the talk that Ron Wilkins was involved in, Ron said to me one time, he went, he thinks, to 14 or 15 of those 33 funerals. In any event, that 1965 rebellion often is used as a kind of dividing line for historians of the 60s and of the Black freedom struggle to talk about the kind of civil rights phase that took place before, centered in the South, framed around nonviolence, and the period that takes place after, centered in the cities, the North and the West and the Midwest, and framed around the question of armed self-defense, Black nationalism, third world liberation, and the like. So LA becomes an important place in not just the local history, but in thinking about how to establish a dividing line in the broader history of the United States. As we go forward into the time of my own adolescence, this is from 1992, and we start to see a shift, right, where a race riot no longer means, as it did in the Tulsa time, white people coming into a Black neighborhood to destroy it, or in the 1960s, a struggle of African Americans, usually against police violence and brutality, to react to that external security presence or that external kind of colonized force. Instead, in 1992, as people probably know, we see that rage directed particularly at the immigrant population of Korean and Korean American shopkeepers. So that 1992 moment becomes a moment where the racial conflict is often described in a Black-white way, but that container can't really explain what's happening. So for instance, there is a demonstration, there is a protest against police violence, against the Rodney King beating, against the Latasha Harlins murder. That's clear. But there's also this rage directed at a shopkeeping class that's perceived of as foreign. And then, of course, as we know, of the 52,000 people arrested, something like 29,000 of them are Latinx folks, Central American people in the MacArthur district, smaller numbers of Mexican American and Mexican immigrant populations. But the point is, this is a multi-ethnic riot, perhaps the first in the United States that's really thought of as such. And in the aftermath of that 1992 rebellion, the primary notion of a racial conflict in Southern California switches from being around a Black-white antagonism to being around a brown-black or a Black-brown antagonism. And you see this in two of the places that are really key for understanding our society: prisons and schools, particularly high schools, because these are places often where everything from new styles to new political ideas is being incubated. They're really critical institutions for understanding the United States. So at Jefferson High School, a high school that is in the heart of South LA, one of the historic, venerable South Central high schools. In 2005, you see a major explosion of hostility between Black and brown students. Police are on campus, police are off campus, classes are suspended, arrests are made, and you start to see a notion there that is saying this conflict is escalating and has been bubbling for a long time. Wayside Detention, Pritchett Detention Center, or Wayside Jails out by Magic Mountain. People will know this one because they will have been passed it on the 5. And the violence inside the jail gets so bad, 2005, 6, and 7, that the sheriffs decide to take the dramatic, unconstitutional, and probably unavoidable step of segregating inmates by race. And it's really the first time in the history of California that inmates are segregated by race, and it's done as a protective mechanism because the Black inmates in particular are considered to be so badly outnumbered in this jail that the sheriffs feel they can't keep them safe. And so we have this idea that a conflict is spreading. And again, just to put myself into the story a little bit, if you look here at this map on the far right, there's a kind of pale green and like a light blue. That light blue shade is territory claimed by the East Coast Crips. And the kind of pale green, which overlaps actually with it, is claimed by Florencia 13, which is a predominantly Latinx street organization. My grandmother's house is just about due south from where, if you were to draw a line from those two restaurant symbols with the fork and the knife, a diagonal line in between the two of them, well, a straight line, you can't draw a diagonal line. That would be my grandmother's house. And so I spent a lot of time in this neighborhood growing up and even into my 20s. And to say a little story about it, when we moved there, I mean, before I was born, when we got there during the Second World War, this is really my stepmother's grandfather, or my stepmother's father. He was a very fair-skinned man. He was from Louisiana. He identified as Black, but in Louisiana, they would have identified him as Creole. And so he had a kind of a funny accent. He spoke French. And so the people who sold him the house, they weren't quite sure what he was. He wasn't Mexican, they didn't think, unless he was some kind of weird Mexican, maybe a Portuguese. They didn't know any French people, so that they couldn't tell who he was, but they didn't think he was Black. They sold him the house. When the rest of the family showed up later in 1943, big trouble, right? Then they realized who they'd sold to. There was already one Black family on the block, but it was the arrival of a second Black family that really sent the neighbors into a spasm. It burned a cross on our lawn and made several efforts to kind of drive us out. It didn't work. And gradually, all the white people left the block. When I was growing up, all but 2 households on my grandmother's street on 58th and Hooper were African American. By the time my grandmother passed away, early 21st century, there were 2 African American families, and the rest of the block were Latinx families. So she lived firsthand this transformation of South Central LA from being predominantly white to overwhelmingly Black to almost on the east side, 100% Latinx. This area right where she lived was the site of a major conflict that lasted more than 10 years between the East Coast Crips and Florencia 13. Finally, in 2009, a truce was declared between the two groups. That truce, for the most part, so far has held. But it gave me a kind of firsthand, first-person sense of what this conflict was about. Although, actually, I was very much there for an earlier phase of it as well, which I want to talk about. It's just a graphic representation. If you look at the Harbor Freeway, which is the line coming down sort of more or less the middle of this, you can see the east side shifting dramatically from being more than 60% African-American to being a majority Latinx. And that, again, is the shift that occurs for me in my 20s and late teens, and all throughout my 20s, and then ultimately in my early 30s. So it's, again, something that I experienced and saw and lived through and amidst. The place where this violence began as a significant social force, though, was not in South LA. It wasn't in South Central. It wasn't in this place that was undergoing the largest demographic transformation from one minority population to another in the history of the United States. Rather, it was in Venice Beach. Well, in Venice, which is where I was from, where I grew up. And in 1994, 93, throughout 94 and early into 1995, this would have been my sophomore, junior, and senior years as a college student, there was an explosion of violence between the two gangs that claimed Venice, right? The Venice Shoreline Crips and V13. And my introduction to this came at the Venice Boardwalk, which is a space that most people know. I was playing dominoes at the basketball courts. Spot, again, a lot of you guys probably will know because it's the second most popular tourist destination in Southern California, besides for Disneyland. And we're there, we're doing our thing, man. There's 4 of us, all black, playing dominoes, and these 2 essays walked by, and they lift up their shirts and they flashed us their pieces. 2 of the other, 3 guys I was with, they leaned back in their chairs and they flashed their pieces. And I'm looking around, what am I going to dive under? What am I going to do? What is going on? And then, boom, essays walk past, game resumes, everything continues. But all through that summer, I was home again between my junior and senior years. There was this kind of simmering tension. And by the time it was over, by the time a truce was called and held, about 18 people had been killed and about 50 or 60 had been wounded. In a very small area. We're talking about overwhelmingly this happening in an area that's just a few miles square, right? The Oakwood district, which is a part of Venice Beach, part of Venice, which is a historically Black and historically Latinx neighborhood, one of the only majority minority neighborhoods on a coastal area in all of the state of California. You might find some Black and brown communities in Seaside up by that crazy Hearst Ranch. There's Imperial Beach. But by and large, for a time, there was Ocean Park just on the other side of Oakwood. But for the most part, this is the last predominantly working class and Oceanside, Black and brown neighborhood with a coastal presence in California. And so this conflict was happening the same time that massive amounts of gentrification were happening. It was happening while the LAPD were still embarrassed at their failure to, from their point of view, control the Rodney King rebellion. So there were a lot of external inputs coming in at the same time. And so this violence that starts in the mid-1990s and goes to basically the end of the, up until around 2009, 2010, marks a really abrupt turnaround, a real departure from an earlier moment of considerable affinity between Latinx, between Chicano, Mexicano, and African-American people, right? And you can see just a couple of examples of that. You see on the far right, African-American zoot suiters. So if you look at youth culture, everything from zoot suiting to rock and roll, to what we would today call oldies, to the lowrider car culture. These are all spaces that were shared between Black and brown, right? When I was a little guy, there was a Venice lowrider club, predominantly Chicano, and they would click up with the Black guys in the morning, Sundays. Everybody would drive down to Crenshaw. Black folks would hang a right turn on Venice Boulevard. They'd do their thing on Crenshaw. Essays and folks would go all the way out to Whittier, chill, hang out, connect back up. People wind up back in Venice, right? There is amity. Even if sometimes there was avoidance, the general trend was toward a kind of cousinly relationship between those communities. More firmly, you can see here on the far left, that's Bobby Seale, one of the co-founders of the Black Panther Party with Cesar Chavez. A lot of people think that Cesar Chavez is kind of like the Chicano Dr. King. The reality is his affinities, maybe not ideologically, but personally, were much closer to a lot of the Panthers. The Panthers did a lot of work with the UFW, as did the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Many of the people who were involved in the Panthers had been agricultural workers. My dad was picked peaches and almonds. My grandmother was a migrant worker. She picked cotton in the Central Valley, not far from where you guys are. And so there was a longer history of African Americans, as Stan and others will well know, in those areas which presupposed a relationship to Latinx people. So you can see here another person who had a very important role in and around the history of Bakersfield, Mac Lyons, who was a close confidant of Cesar Chavez, along with Dolores Huerta and Philip Veracruz, that whole kind of initial UFW leadership. The way I think about this kind of transition to a space from amity and coalition and connectivity to a space of enmity is through reference to another place and another political context. And I think it's very important. You know, Guyana is a place that 90% of Americans don't know anything about, and the 10% who know anything only know about Jim Jones. The reality is it's a very useful place for thinking about the United States. It's a place that is a majority minority nation. It's a place that has come out of a space of settler colonialism. It's a place with significant populations of people of Indian descent, as well as indigenous people. When I say Indian here, I mean South Asian people, as well as people of African descent. It's a place that's always produced radical thinkers and activists. Chetty Jagan here was the first South Asian to be a prime minister outside of the Indian subcontinent. Walter Rodney, one of the critical figures of Black radical thinking. And Rodney wrote about the difficulty in bringing together the Indian and African Guyanese populations. You know, and what he said is, existing aspects of cultural convergence were insufficiently developed to contribute decisively to solidarity among the working people of two major racial groups. So what Rodney was saying there in this book is he was saying culture, music, art, food, fashion, speech patterns, all of that stuff was a bridge between the two communities, but those bridges kept being ruptured by being put in different occupations, by being put in different neighborhoods, by being treated differently or policed differently, that the state and the colonial apparatus made repeated efforts to use racial animus as a way to define these communities so that they couldn't unify around seizing class power in Guyanese context, right? So when I think about the story of African Americans, and especially again, Chicano, Latino, Mexicano, Mexican American people in Southern California, look at the 1950s and 60s, you have tremendous amount of cultural convergence, and even into the 1970s. By the 1980s and 90s, you see that start to break down. The forces of recession, mass incarceration, the collapse of the labor market for working class people, new other kinds of marketing that affects each of those communities directly, as well as the opportunism of politicians in both groups, that kind of fear, mobilization around people are losing out, we're losing our neighborhood, you're losing your jobs, you know, those people are dangerous, all these kind of shibboleths that are used to divide those communities. So that in between the possibility of bringing working class unity across racial difference and the necessity of culture as a glue to bind those together, I find very useful for thinking about California in this context. So this is another slide. It shows two women. The woman on the right was Chetty Jagan's wife, Janet. The woman on the left is a woman named Andaye, Sandra Williams, who was a really fundamentally important Caribbean revolutionary theorist of both Black liberation, interethnic solidarity, the liberation of women. Really, she passed away late last year. It was a major loss. And if you're interested, I got it somewhere around here. There's a book of her speeches and writings that just got published. It's called The Point is to Change the World, and I highly recommend it. Andaye talked about racial conflict in Guyana, and she said what happened was what she called a rupture of neighborliness. And so what happened is those patterns by which you'd interact day by day on the street with people began to become more and more difficult. There was a physical separation that led to a cultural separation that led to an ideological separation that led to a conflict. And that pattern of going away from being able to live together around people who were seen as part of your community to understanding yourself as living around people who are different than you became part of the animus in Guyana, which is expressed repeatedly as riots. You know, tremendous numbers of ethnically based riots in Guyana from the 90s to the present. So in the context of this kind of idea of racial and ethnic rivalry or violence, I want to ask, with the time I have left, what role can art play in producing that kind of cultural convergence that might speak to a different kind of relationship on the part of, let's say, minoritized or ethnic or non-white people? And more specifically, what does visual art do that maybe music or fashion or other forms of creativity do not? And in particular, I want to talk about two visual modes, two genres, muralism and photography. So I'm just going to go through a couple of images, talk a little bit, and I know I talk a long time, so I'll try not to go too long, and I'll try to have some internal discipline. So right after that Rodney King rebellion in '92, but even before that mode, that kind of moment of violence in Venice, a woman named Lizette LaFalle Collins, who was an art history graduate student at UCLA, started working on a museum exhibition on African-American artists and Mexican muralism. That's the one you see on the right. 2000, 2008, the National Museum of Mexican Art, which is based in Chicago, did another exhibition on Africa's presence in Mexico. And those are kind of the bookends for what we're talking about. They appeared in these high moments of violence, and they tried to produce a counter narrative to the notion of these communities as either wholly separate from each other and certainly as doomed to a kind of inevitable conflict as a result. So to talk a little bit about muralism first, the Mexican muralist movement in the 1930s and 40s, associated, of course, with Siqueiros, Orozco, and Diego Rivera, was a kind of worldwide moment of high influence of Mexican art around the politics of revolutionary claiming of space, right? Murals go on walls. They're seen by anyone who passes by. They're often, very expressive and didactic. They have a message. They're not abstract normally. And so here on the left in Orozco's mural, and on the right in a mural by Siqueiros, it was in Los Angeles, it was destroyed. You can see in both cases African-American figures positioned in the center. And you see that as fairly typical in Mexican muralist movement murals, that if they have a US context, African-Americans will be present as workers, as families, as people included as part of the struggle, depicted beyond and without any kind of recourse to segregation. So in this other mural, which was painted in 1932, you can see a Black man holding a child, a white woman holding a child. Implicitly there, you have a scene that rejects the legal and common notion of Black and white people as needing to be separated in the name of a kind of unity of working people. A number of African-American muralists, Charles Alston among them, went either to Mexico to study with the muralists, or in the case of Alston, knew Rivera when he was in New York working on other murals. This is a piece on the Negro in California history. It was at the Golden Life Mutual Insurance building on Western and Adams for a long, long time. I believe that building has been sold. I don't think it's there any longer. But again, he was a person with a direct connection to this Mexican muralist movement. A movement that we often, at least in Southern California, associate with the Latinx community. Some of the most important pieces of public art in LA certainly are murals that depict histories, issues of concern, community experiences. So here you have Judy Baca's a section from the Great Wall of Los Angeles, which shows the Dodger Stadium, which was built on a Mexican-American radio, as well as the construction of the freeway system, which divided a number of different ethnic Mexican and other non-white neighborhoods from each other. So again, that idea of development and the thing that Anglos experience and enjoy and need, a professional sports team, ease of transportation, as being enacted and erected on the back of Mexican people. Again, there's Olabisi's piece. That Mexican-American muralist tradition is very strong, but there's also a tradition of African-American muralism in Southern California. So this mural was painted by Freeman, a guy named Charles Freeman, who'd been a member of the Black Panther Party, as well as Nona Olabisi. But it was painted at a school, which was one of the first new schools built in decades in in LA Unified. It was actually built on a toxic site. And that site was the location of a major environmental justice movement led by 3 middle school girls initially, 2 Latinas and African-American girl. By the time they got into high school, they continued to fight for abatement at this particular school and cleanup. And eventually the school was closed because it was so polluted until it could be cleaned up and reopened. So again, as with Olabisi's mural, this one is going to have a mixture of pre-colonial, pre-Columbian, African and indigenous themes, along with kind of important texts about both the conquest and the enslavement of African Americans, to suggest education as a kind of path toward emancipation and liberation, and the like. This is Olabisi's mural on the Panthers, which I like the kind of link to the Che mural. Again, we're talking about 1960s, national liberation. This mural, which was designed and executed by Mario Torero, who's a San Diego-based Chicano artist. There's actually an African-American woman who worked on this one as well. So oftentimes in these murals, we find that content we associate with one community might have a role of another community in playing with. And murals are extremely important, right? Because they claim space, they're public art. So rather than the idea of art as something you keep on your wall, you hide away, or that rich people enjoy, or that goes into a museum, murals are a very public representation of who has access to or who controls a space. And so these kind of Black and brown murals around unity in Southern California, there's probably a few dozen of them if you add them all up, scattered around, most of which are painted in that mid-90s to mid-2000s moment, I think are an important attempt to kind of fix South LA and other Compton, Linwood, Venice, other areas as places that are shared spaces between Black and brown. And if you look at the work of scholars like Sid Martinez or Abigail Rosas, Manuel Pastor, people who are writing about South LA, you see a lot of that literature about the shift from a race-based notion of who belongs there to a place-based notion of who belongs there as one way for Black and brown communities to align and to find common cause around the issues that they both confront. This is another mural. This one's in Compton. It's called Getting to Know You by Elliot Pinckney. And again, some of these are muralists who go back to the 50s and 60s and 70s. They were part of the Black liberation struggle. And as you bring them into this new moment, you see them doing more and more interethnic or intercommunal kind of work. The other mode I want to talk a little bit about is photography. I won't take a long time, but just to say that alongside this mural moment, in the 1990s and again into the early years of the 21st century, you see an expansion of photographic exhibitions, not just in galleries, but also at schools, community centers, especially universities, LMU, UCLA, Cal State Long Beach, Dominguez Hills, a number of places aimed particularly at depicting a shared legacy of African-American and Mexican identity through the depiction of Afro-Mexican people. And the person who really pioneered this was a man named Tony Gleaton. Ibaye, Tony's dead now. He was a fashion photographer. He worked for Vogue, and then he quit the kind of fashion world. And he began to take more art photography all throughout the Americas, but particularly in Mexico and Central America around these communities of people of African descent in Honduras, Guatemala, and especially in Mexico, Oaxaca, and Guerrero, that were unknown, right? These were isolated communities. They were rural communities. They were communities that people didn't really acknowledge in the national context. So Gleaton's photography really did two things in the Mexican context and a third thing in the US context. it pointed to people of African descent as a living, vital part of Mexico. And that was a dual intervention. That was something that was new in the Mexican context, and it was something that was came as news to many African Americans, right, who might have known about Black people in Brazil, or obviously had some links to Africa politically, conceptually, who might know about Caribbean populations, Afro descendientes in Puerto Rico or Cuba, or maybe even Colombia, but who weren't used to thinking of Mexico as a country that had a significant Black population. And so they really began to push through these photographic expositions the idea of Mexico as a country that was also a Black country, right? And so some of that was graphic, some of it was historical, pointing out that Vicente Guerrero was a person of African descent, Pio Pico, right, the governor of California, Yanga, that the first slave rebellion in the Americas took place in Mexico. But secondly, Gleaton's photography is very effective, right? It's not didactic. It's not like a mural that's really kind of in your face with a message you get right away. It's more restrained. So this is a picture called La Boda, which shows a marriage between two Mexican people in the town of Cuajini-Cuilapa, a tiny little town on the Oaxaca-Guerrero border, what they call the Costa Chica. One man who is of very obvious African descent, a young woman who is predominantly mestiza, indigenous background. Gleaton does a lot of these kind of things that are family photographs that show people of African descent in Mexico in the context of Mexicanidad, right? These are not exceptional people. The point is that they exist. They're part of the national fabric. They're real Mexicans. They're not people who crept across from Guatemala and don't know who Hugo Sanchez was or how to sing Cielito Lindo. You know, they're real, quote unquote, Mexican people, and that idea is a repudiation of the silencing of that population historically. This is what I like called La Peluqueria. It sort of works in both the kind of rural context, in the context of Mexico, and also as a kind of effective space of African Americanness. So in a lot of Gleaton's photography, although the message is very understated, it speaks to a commonality, right? So a man who's playing dominoes, showing you his hand. This other man who's a little bit out of focus in the background. So this is a kind of image that's comprehensible simultaneously to two audiences. The same on the right? This is a very interesting one, Las Muñecas, the dolls, because for me, it speaks not just to, of course, these issues of what kind of toys people play with, the universal aspect of having a tiny little human to play with when you're a kid, but specifically that doll test, right, that Kenneth and Mamie Clark did about the self-image of Black people when confronted with a white doll and a Black doll. And that was one of the bedrocks, ultimately, of the overturning of school segregation and the Brown decision, right? So there's these kind of ways in Gleaton's photography that he takes Mexican subjects and he presents them in ways that have a specific resonance, or at least an explicable resonance with a Black audience. And that was part of the strategy for starting to think about how to link these two communities together. And Gleaton himself said, you know, we've known each other for a long time. If you go back to the 19th century West, the cowboys are Black and Mexican. It's a dirty job. It's dangerous. And if you took the indigenous and the Blacks and the Mexicans out of the West, there'd not be very many people left. And most of the ones who were left would have been Chinese workers. You know, so we're not strangers, he would say. We're part of an extended family. And I think when you see his photography, you see that notion of a familial connection, which is kind of different from the murals, right? Which tend to portray Blackness on one side, Latinidad on the other, and a space of meeting in the middle. So there's distinct visual strategies that come up in each point. I'm almost done, got about 2 more minutes. We're talking about this gentleman who some of you guys met before, who, like Gleaton, got very interested in taking photographs of these communities. These two women, girls, I say women because these two are about my age on the right. This photograph's from the 1980s. They're cousins. So again, he would take this picture and he would show audiences. He'd say, you know, don't they look like they're good friends? And the audience would say, oh yeah, I look like really good friends. They're not friends, they're related. You know, and so again, Ron was very interested in portraying these two communities as having a connection in Southern California, but also as having a connection in Mexico. Another way he would do this, again, is through this kind of interesting juxtaposition. In fact, if you see behind me, the photograph you see on the left is hanging behind me. So when you look at these two, they're very similar pictures. They look, even the bricks look like they're taken maybe opposite sides of the street or similar times. If you look at the clothes, you kind of might get a little bit of a different sense. The photograph on the left is from 1970. It's in Cairo, Illinois. The photograph on the right is South LA in 1993. But oftentimes they would be hung together, again, as a way to suggest some of the commonalities. If you look at the girls in the center, and these aren't posed photographs, they're candid shots, right? Where he walked by and he said, wait, stay right there. And I just like, you kind of get a lot of interiority in both of these pictures. If you look at them long enough, you kind of feel like you sort of know what people might be thinking, what they're thinking about the person taking their picture, what they're thinking about the people next to them. And you get a very powerful sense of the commonality of experience, being a working class young girl in the city, and all of the things that you live and you do to find humor and life and survival in this kind of context. And so I find them to be very powerful, again, in ways that are not didactic, where the audience gets to determine what the audience finds or sees in them. So this is my final point, just to say that the photography of Gleaton and Wilkins came about again in this mid-1990s moment. I want to just draw attention to two other figures. The priest on the right is a guy named Padre Glenn Jamont. He's a Trinidadian priest who was a parish priest in the Costa Chica region and was an early organizer of a group called Mexico Negro, Black Mexico, which began to push for the constitutional recognition of Afro-descendiente people in the Mexican census. On the left, you have two men, a villager, and next to him is a guy named Bobby Vaughn, who is a Black American anthropologist, who was also conducting field work, taking pictures, and helping with the kind of initial organizing of Black Mexico. So what starts to happen in the 90s and going forward, until last year, when for the first time there was a constitutional box for people of African descent in Mexico to identify themselves as such, is a real wellspring of Afro-Mexican organizing, tied not even so much to the United States as to developments all throughout Latin America, but also tied in fundamental ways to the organization of indigenous people in southern Mexico. So you can see on the left, of course, a Zapatista manifestation. On the right, an encuentro, a meeting held in Oaxaca that brings distinct indigenous groups together, Triqui, Amusco, Mixtecas, along with Afrodescendientes. So as Native people were getting organized in Mexico, you started to see that translating to Afro-Mexican communities, the same time that people in Honduras and Brazil and Guatemala are organizing on the basis of Blackness. And as you start to see these English-speaking African-Americans and Afro-Caribbeans coming in. And so that whole blend is coming together. And I end with just pointing out that for me, it becomes a kind of link that's about a transnational political organizing. These are images that are circulating in a political context. So they're not about diversity, they're not about inclusion, they're not about equity, they're about the revolutionary self-organization of these communities. So in 2012, you see Emory Douglas, who is a graphic artist and a minister of culture for the Black Panther Party in the 60s and 70s, traveling to Mexico City, to Oaxaca, to Chiapas, meeting with people in the EZLN. And out of that comes this Zapatera Negra art exhibition, art practice, art moment, where you start to see a kind of convening together of Panther and Zapatista-based art. So here you see a Black woman, African woman, with a huipil and the spears. You see this kind of visual blending of our two communities. And again, through graphic art, posters, photography, muralism, in ways that suggest that the true link isn't just place and space-based, but it's based on a kind of shared affinity for political transformation. So that's the end. of the prepared remarks. And I'd be more than happy to hear thoughts, reactions, comments, questions.
Wow, thank you so much. So much history. My wife's a little bit of a historian, and so when we travel, and we used to go to to Mexico and the surrounding cities, and we would always look for the African American Museum. And the fact that they're everywhere in Mexico is just amazing. Cancun has one. Puerto Vallarta has one. All the towns where we used to travel, we look for that before we even went and see where it was and visit. And lots of times they were closed, so you had to come back because they would only stay open on like Tuesday and Thursday, or from this time to this time. So we'd have to go back, but we'd always go in and look around, and we were always welcome. And it didn't matter who was in the museums, but African American, Mexican, or true Mexican, all of them treated us like we were family, and it was wonderful, and that we wanted to know our history down there. Plus, there's like you said, the books. There's so many books on the joining of the two races, and let's face it, in the 50s, Blacks went to Paris to get away from oppression, but back in the day, but way before that, you're right, African Americans would go down to Mexico and be accepted, and plus they were slaves, and the ones that got free would stay down there and be part of the culture. So thank you for so much information that's bringing back some memories of my travels, and I love it.
Well, I would just say there are two things, for the students who are in the class. I always tell people, go and see. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the Costa Chica is pretty inaccessible, although there are some roads now. But the most recent Afro-Mexican, they have these gatherings of the different villages. The most recent one was in November the most recent one I was at was in November of 2019. It was in Mexico City. It's easy to get to Mexico City. It's as easy as getting to New York. So I would recommend people keep their eye, on that and their ear to the ground. The first person who I know who was in those areas was a guy named Mel Mason. Mel Mason is a former Panther. He's from Central California. And he was in Tijuana for an El Salvador solidarity meeting. Some people were coming from El Salvador and they couldn't get into the States. They went there. And he just decided to take a little time, and his car broke down, driving around Mexico, and the guy who helped fix his car was a Black guy. And he said, where are you from? And the guy says, oh, villages over here, come see. So we're there, the Black population is everywhere on every continent of this planet. The other place that's really interesting is in Coahuila. There's a town called Nacimiento. And that is populated by Muskogee people who were Black Seminoles who fled Texas and were given land by the Mexican government. So if you're interested in that, there's a new book by a woman who's at USC, and I think it's called South to Freedom. And it deals with that. It's just a profound history, and it's a history that unfortunately lots of us are in our 20s before we hear about it for the first time.
Very, very, very true. Let me get to some of these questions. Well, I do have one myself, and we'll get to that later on, but the census, you were talking about how the freeway and the different things were separating the Blacks and the Browns when they had finally come together and been a community together and so on. And people saw, especially politicians, see power in numbers. And so if I'm a Black politician, I would like the freeway to go right here so I can have more Blacks in my community to vote for me than Hispanics. And if I'm a Hispanic politician, I want the more Hispanics in my neighborhood to vote for me. And so how did census play a part in the history that I know most of us are, but how did census play in that?
Yeah, I mean, there's countries in the world, like in Lebanon, for instance, for a long time, it was against the law to have a census because Lebanon is very closely divided between Muslim and Christian people. It was set up as a colonial, Christian outpost, but also between different congregations, the Druze, Sunni people, Shia people. And so the numbers of actually who lives there is very fraught politically. Nigeria historically has been another place where this was the case. So the first thing about the census is, just like a map or a museum, it carries power. And the segment of the population where we have the most consistent tension between Black and Brown are in two populations. The people who are sort of, I'm not going to use the term underclass. I'll use the classic term, which is the lumpen people. So these are folks who are out of the labor force, gangsters, incarcerated people, people who are not intended by the system that we have to be able to survive, right? They're hustlers, and they are people who rely on themselves as individuals. And so that is why we see a lot of tension in prisons. The second group that historically has had an interest in this tension are politicians, and during the war on poverty, people who were competing for Office of Economic Opportunity grants, because you're saying we're serving this community, and it becomes a zero-sum game. Where you don't find a lot of that tension is at the workplace, especially if you're dealing with stable, like in the 60s and 70s, unionized plants, other kinds of spots like that. So my point is to say that tension between Black and Brown people has a class component to it. And the stronger the working class is, which is the majority of both of our communities, the less tension there is. When working class people are pressed, and some are falling down and some are tentatively trying to claw their way upward, that's where you start to see a lot of rivalry. So for instance, the post office has never been a space of rivalry, but HR departments at CSU and community colleges have been. The DMV has been. So it really depends on whether we're in a moment of expansion or a moment of contraction, which is why the communities have a common interest in pushing for an increase in resources, obviously to everybody. One of the questions in the chat concerned high schools. And what I think is interesting about the high schools, and the reason I show the high school on the same slide as the prison, is we can say something like the school to prison pipeline, and it's like saying race, class, gender, or intersectionality. It's a word, and as soon as we utter it, we think we know what we said, and it disappears away. The high schools and the prisons are more closely connected than ever before in our society. And so the style and the patterns flow from one to the other. So what started the war in Venice, in part, was instructions that came from the prisons to groups on the street about how they were meant to behave toward other communities. I'm going to speak very carefully. Most of the people who are the most active in the youth organization subcultures are high school age people. If you're a hardcore, if you're a Crippen, or you're in a multi-generational SA family, by the time you're 18 or 19, you're either out or you're locked up. This is a young man's game. And so the prisons and the high schools are almost mirrors of each other, especially in a moment of mass incarceration and where we don't have jobs for people who don't necessarily have college degrees. I believe other people might have other opinions. So I don't think it's inevitable that a Black politician can't prosper in a predominantly Latino district and vice versa, but it requires organizing around principles rather than race. Now, for the Black community, we've shown time and again a willingness to do that, right? They dumped the DA in LA and got a white guy because he's more progressive than the Black woman who was there. And the Latino community is the same, but they have to have good people to vote for. And our communities have to be organized, whether they're organized at work or through creativity or through recreation, some kind of structures that people can adhere to so that they're not floating individually through this life become really vital.
And you're right. I think the neighborhood tends to vote for the best person as opposed to the color or the name. Where, like you said, up in mobile communities tend to draw together on what exactly they want and then who exactly they want, as opposed to this person is a good person, I'm going to vote for him, and so on and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't know all the Black people in America, and I don't know all the Mexican people in America, but I have never met a Black person who couldn't point to one Black person they did not like, and the same has always been true of Latinx people. So yeah, we should give our communities enough credit to understand that when presented with clear choices, our peoples will make most of the time the correct choices. It's when those choices are circumscribed or mystification and obfuscation come in that people can be led in directions that are counterproductive to their own interests.
Yeah, thank you. This person asked the question, to what degree does regions such as SoCal or say Texas or other parts of the US become important in creating inter-ethnic culture work?
This is a genius question, really. It's fantastic. Texas is not California. New Mexico is not California. In fact, Northern California and Southern California are different places. So in the context of Texas, you have two things that you don't really have in the same way in California. You had a much stronger tradition of enslavement of African people in Texas. I mean, my great-great-grandfather did come to California as a baby, and he was enslaved. But the vast majority of Black folks in California came here as free people. So there's a legacy in Texas. And part of that legacy manifests as a different attitude toward whiteness on the part of ethnic Mexican people. The terror of white supremacy in Texas has been so great that the last thing you want to do is affiliate yourself with Blackness. There's also geographic difference, right, between East Texas and the Rio Grande Valley. And finally, Texas has a nationalist education system. You take Texas history all through school, and you learn a mythical vision of Texas that infects people when they become adults. We don't do that in California, and we should. We should be teaching people about the struggles of California people, and it would produce an even stronger idea about progressive orientation. In New Mexico, you have a conflict between indigenous people and so-called Hispanos that is really different than what manifested in the 70s in Southern California around Chicanidad and indigenism. So geography is vital and it's fundamental. It shapes the kinds of organizations that are going to take hold and take root. That being said, at the end of the day, we're dealing with the basic challenge of what are going to be the predominant patterns of race, quote unquote, relations in a majority minority setting. And I think California is more representative of where things are going than Texas is, for a variety of reasons. I don't want to go into all of them now, but time will tell.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. This is what I was interested in. I'm extremely intrigued on the political arts. Is there a text you can recommend on political arts and political cartoons? And I remember when I started to buy art, I was looking for Black art, and I found myself stuck buying Bull Durham posters, because that was the only Black art, and you look at the characters and they're just stereotyped and so on. And so, but that was the only Black art that was out there at the time. So do you have any recommendations for this student?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, especially, yes, I would say I'm a collector of political posters, and there's a great archive in Southern California called the Center for the Study of Political Graphics. I put it in the chat. There's also a group called Dignidad Rebelde that you may know. These are art collectives or art repositories, but in both cases, they have searchable online databases that you can like, I want to look at something that's got to do with housing or with nuclear activism or with environmental stuff or indigenous ideas, and a lot of stuff will come out. In terms of, books, I mean, at most of our schools, we have people who are teaching classes on, now, luckily, African-American art, Chicano, Chicana, Latinx art. So we have an ability to find stuff that we didn't maybe, before, but I will say that the other person you should, look up as a starting point is Elizabeth Catlett. There's some good stuff on her, both secondary sources and just material on her stuff. And then finally, go to galleries. They have free food. Well, once there's no pandemic, So you're a young person, go there, crash those parties, get the free food, look at what's on the wall, and little by little, you'll find what you like.
Thank you. Could you talk about similarities, differences, and linkage between areas like South Central Watts to Compton, Carson, Gardena, as you talk about demographic changes? Some people didn't go too far. Whites left to Lakewood, Paramount, Downey, and many Blacks left to Carson, Gardena. How can we cast a broader net when thinking about Blacks and Brown relations in LA and avoid essentializing particular areas in LA?
That's a very good point and a good comment. So the answer I would say about that is, if you look at the faculty at USC, it's almost kind of like if you look at one of those gang maps online, we have all these overlapping territories, but like every square inch of the map is colored in. So I know somebody at USC who wrote a book on, it says South Central, but it's really about the kind of corridor from Figueroa to Central. I know someone else has written a book about Echo Park. George Sanchez just finished a book on Boyle Heights. Al Camarillo wrote about Compton, but the reality is you're absolutely right. These are very different, unique places, and they're worthy of unique study. Even if that study is a 90-page MA thesis, a 90-page MA thesis can have more detail and more utility than a 300-page book or a 200-page dissertation. It really depends on the optics and the knowledge and the chops that the scholar brings to it. So those areas are distinct. The challenge, right, for all of these things is trying to find a space where you make the right things general to be able to draw lessons, and you speak with enough specificity so that you do justice to the place you're talking about, right? So I guarantee you that Willowbrook and Compton are more alike than Compton and Georgetown, Guyana are. But in Guyana, I find something that's meaningful in thinking about how you bridge difference and what are the circumstances under which difference becomes unbridgeable. So again, each of us, this is part of what it means to be a thinking person and a person who's thinking politically. You make those investigations and you have to decide, like, nah, the situation in Culver City is so different than the situation in Highland Park in terms of Black people being pushed out of the projects, that there's no point in making that comparison. But it's like, people get really into jazz. If you become too focused specifically on difference, then you become an expert about a very specific place, but you may struggle to explain to people why that expertise is a contribution to where we're trying to go.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, and then Rios has put in the chat. Yeah, man, for sure. There's some good books on Emery's art. Yeah. David Driscoll. You know, there's some very good stuff now. There's a new book on Chicano posters called "Printing the Revolution." Nell Painter wrote a African American history textbook that's basically everything is paired with art. So it's really an art history book. So there's a lot of fantastic stuff.
Thank you so much. Mary, did you want to step in and have any questions?
Well, I think I have just sort of an overall question about, you know, this is intriguing. You talk about an area that I grew up in. I was at 98th and Compton Avenue, so I'm right in the middle of things. And we had very few Latinos in my neighborhood at the time. And now when I go back, I see it's all Latino, just as you were showing on your map. I'm just wondering what, if there were a coalition, a true coalition of Latino and African American in South Central or wherever, what would be their priorities? What would they first want to accomplish? And I know this is, you know, just kind of pie in the sky stuff right now, but what have you speculated about that? Have you thought about that?
So the very first thing that comes to mind, the very first thing is that most people would probably say education, but I would probably say property. And by that, I don't just mean home ownership, but I also mean a real pattern of community investment and a real pattern of rights for tenants as well as homeowners. That, you know, all of our communities, whether we're talking about indigenous people or people of African descent, Latinx people, Afro-descendientes, we live in extremely valuable places. And even when we get moved, we always get moved to a valuable place and we get displaced again, right? So there's an amount of wealth in South LA that is vital for people not to lose, you know? And so I would say we need to find ways to arrest those elements that make our communities devalued. The other thing I think is that, you know, it would be very interesting in South LA because, you know, my dad is from Watts, right? And we talked about this. And, you know, the pattern of his generation was to move out, in part because, you know, in the 70s and 80s, the neighborhoods became so violent. It will be very interesting to see what mobility looks like for lower middle class and middle class Latinx families in the generation to come, right? Whether those are folks who decide to stay in the neighborhood or whether they follow that kind of pattern that we saw in like East LA, Lincoln Heights, Boyle Heights, where you go, you know, they went east or Black folks went to, you know, Riverside and so forth. So I think the key right now in South LA is making sure that the people who live there, Black and brown, can remain. And the rest of it will follow from that. But that's, you know, that's my guess. I live in San Diego, so I can't say.
Well, Professor Widener, I was hoping that you would say something, since this is you know, we're a group that is addressing the criminal justice system. So, and I know you know that both groups are very concerned with policing, especially. That's the first contact with the community is the cops, right? So do you feel as if the Latinx, Latino community are as committed to change? You know, Governor Newsom just, you know, with his introduction of this sweeping police bill. I'm just wondering if Latinos are as invested as African Americans are.
I mean, I think, you know, there's plenty of people on our in our Q&A and on our call who have ideas about this. So I welcome their comments. I guess I have a couple of thoughts about that question. And I think the short answer would probably be yes and no. I think that the security forces of the state affect Black and Brown people in similar but different ways. And so I think, for instance, my dad's 82. He is more likely to be pulled over by a white policeman if he's in Newport Beach or driving to see me in San Diego or goes back to his old stomping grounds than probably an 85-year-old Latinx man would be. Because the police are conditioned almost like a Pavlovian response to hone in on Black people. But there's an entire apparatus about deportation and the criminalization of immigrant people that doesn't have any, distinct parallel with us. They're trying with the Haitians and Cameroonians. But the Border Patrol couldn't function one single day without Latinx labor. And that's not true of the policing apparatus vis-a-vis Black people. If you took all the Black cops out, they could fake it till they make it. So I think there's a difference that flows from the fact that Latinx people are close to a majority in California. And so there's a different pattern of policing a majority as a colonial settler than policing a minority. And I think that that requires our communities to find a language that is more complicated, that isn't necessarily slogans or catchphrases, but that speaks to the different concerns and fears. I remember, in the Rampart scandal, going back a little ways now, Gloria Molina got asked, I think it was Molina, I could be wrong. It was a major elected official, Latina. And she got asked why so many of the politicians who were showing up to denounce the LAPD were Black, when most of the people who were victims of the police malfeasance at Ramparts were Latinos. And this elected official said, well, these people are not the best people of our community. That's an attitude that a Black politician would struggle to articulate even if they felt it. And so there is a difference. And I think you're really right to draw attention to those differences. And I would say only that they can only be worked through place by place, group by group, campaign by campaign. That's the hard work of building multi-ethnic movements, right? It's easier for that orange turkey just to stand up and say, everybody who doesn't look like you is the enemy. I mean, any of us could do that. But what we're doing is much more difficult.
But one of the things that did come out of that was the Blacks would look at the Latinx and say, if they do this to you, or they do this to me, they can do it to you. And it was like, if you accept it and don't say anything or don't make any noise, they can do it to you, and like they're doing it to me. And if you don't support me, I won't support you, and we'll both be in trouble. And so that a bond did grow during that time. Somewhat of a bond did grow between those two, between the police malfeasance.
No, that's right. I mean, and from the point of view of the African-American population, Black population, and I want to get to Ariana's question about Afrodescendiente folks as well. So for us, it's really interesting. Every time there's a natural disaster, you find Black politicians go absolutely apeshit if anybody calls the Black Americans refugees. We're not refugees, we're Americans, and they get into this thing, and it doesn't matter right, left, or center. They get deeply wounded and offended at the idea that we somehow are suffering the same thing that those people over there, are suffering. And I never call myself African American. And sometimes when I say that to people, they're like, yeah, you're not African, of course, you've never been to Africa. So well, I have been to Africa, but that's not the point. The point is, I don't consider myself an American. I'm not invested in America. I'm not interested in it. It doesn't do anything for me. When you define yourself as African American, you're aligning yourself to the United States, and you're implicitly cutting yourself off from Black Panamanians, Namibians, Black people who live in the suburbs of Paris. That's my community. My community is the worldwide African diaspora, the community of struggling people, Indigenous and Latinx people, Asian American people, progressive white people, people who I mean, you look at the oil spill, right? Anybody whose first reaction to that is, why are we still drilling for oil? I don't want to know that person. I don't want to persuade. I'm past persuasion. It's time for struggle. Yeah, I mean, persuade my own people. But if your idea is like, it's okay for the oil to wash up on the beach, later for you, and I think we as Black people in this country are caught between our desire to realize fully what we see as the promise of America, and that promise of inclusion, that we could live without the terror, that our children's lives could have the same chances that the lives of any other child in this society could have. And many of us have gone to the grave fighting for that world. And I don't criticize or judge anybody who has that orientation, but I just don't believe in it. I just don't believe in it. I don't believe in this place. It's lies on lies on lies. And so if we ask, how are people going to live differently? I think that's the struggle I'm interested in. And I think that at least a place where we see each other through the lens of commonality rather than through the lens of difference, is a precondition for surviving the kind of struggle against white supremacy that everybody can see is coming, and so I don't know if that really answers the question. I got a little preachy.
Yeah, that's okay, but
apologize about that.
We could go on forever. We are running out of time.
Let me say something to Ariana then. I just don't. I want to make sure.
There you go.
So two things you can look to. Alicia Garza, who was one of the BLM, early BLM folks, is involved with a project called the Black Futures Lab. It's predominantly a virtual space. And one of the groups that's involved in that is called Mi Gente. And they do a lot of stuff with Afro-Latino communities. It's obviously always something that's stronger on the East Coast with the Cuban and Puerto Rican and Dominican communities. There's a very nice book from Duke that's come out a couple of years ago called The Afro-Latino Reader. I recommend it highly. It's by Juan Flores, was one of the editors, and the other was Miriam. Oh, I can't remember Miriam's last name. Forgive me. That's one. And then the third place that is worth looking is, I spaced out, getting old. But there is some organizing in Southern California. If you just keep your ear to the ground about especially some of the Afro-Mexican stuff is popping off because of the census. And, for me, the place where I find a lot of those communities, not always political, but I'm in a little bit of the Lucumí, Santeria world. And so we meet a lot of folks in the musical context. Keep your eye out for toques and güiros and that kind of stuff, and you'll find your way. Or hang out at feed stores, because we're always going there.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for coming. I wish we had more time. Hopefully we can get you back sometime in the future. And I have tons of questions. I still have a lot of questions.
I want to say something before we close off. I want to speak on the subject, the lack of spoken out of Latino community. And I wanted to say that I come from immigrant parents, and the lack of spoken out is because there's a fear of being hunted down. They're like, me as a person who has been born here has obtained that fear of immigration or being hunted down because of my parents.
Yep.
And it's hard to speak out when you have that fear.
That's absolutely right. That's
sorry.
100%.
It's something so close to me that it's hard to speak on it because it is, I do feel it. I was discriminated by my neighbor, and they said that they were going to threaten to call immigration on us. And it's something that, like, when you're put on that fear, it's hard to speak out because I don't even know how to explain it. Sorry, I'm getting
You've done very well explaining it, Connie.
Absolutely.
And thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much
Connie,
for bringing that up.
Let me say one thing, and I know we're ending. I completely agree. And so the call I make is for those of us who have privilege to interact directly and intervene directly in that situation. So I got nowhere with my colleagues when we tried to get people to go in Southeast San Diego to observe INS who was camping outside of schools. They wear jackets, you know, they stand out. So it doesn't take a lot for us to conduct counter surveillance on them and to run them out. And I agree, those of us who have the privilege of citizenship status have to be the ones who take the first step to show those communities we intend to defend them. Now, defending people is not the same as protecting them. I am not capable of protecting someone against the might of the American state, but I can help defend them. And that's the kind of organizing that we need. In the 70s and 80s, you saw Black and brown people run the Klan off the border because the Nazis tried to have a border watch in San Isidro. And we pushed them out. And then the Border Patrol came back. So again, I understand. And I don't want what we were saying to be a criticism. I think that what happened with the Black community is that we learned the hard way, there was no hiding. And that some of the resistance that came out in the 60s and the 90s and with the BLM folks and the George Floyd stuff that all communities came in with is the recognition, and not just on the part of Black people, that at the end of the day, there's nowhere to hide. That's terror, you know, but the enemy uses terror. That's one of his weapons. And I don't have a solution. I'm a middle-aged college professor. It's not for me to say to people, behave and act differently. I'm just can only share the political and intellectual experiences of my own.
As a community activist, Connie, this is my take on it. Get your pen and your paper out, write your senators, your assembly members, your congressmen, right, and put that political pressure on them.
And for those of us who are citizens and who have a voice, you know, we should be the voice of those who are not.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And rally those people that, like you said, she said, who are citizens and who have, if you know somebody who is somebody, let them know you have a problem, and they can work on your behalf to hopefully take care of that problem.
Thank you, Professor Widener. It's been a pleasure again. You never disappoint. We appreciate it.
I'm grateful to everyone for sharing their time very much and hope to see you all again.
Thank you.